A lot of our work, in my program, we do deal with intersectionality. So we bring in aspects of environmental justice. We work in coalition with partners who are environmental justice organizations, because those communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change are largely low income and communities of color. And then we know within that are, LGBT folks who are marginalized within those communities. So therefore, if you're having these disproportionate impacts on low income or communities of color, then you're also in some ways having even more of a burden on those kind of groups within those groups.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course. I am John Fleming, and I am a senior scientist with the Center for Biological Diversity, he, him pronouns. So the mission of the Center for Biological Diversity is saving life on Earth, and I am part of a climate program within the organization. So we're focused on addressing climate change and its threats to species. So what that actually involves is we engage with environmental laws and regulatory agencies to bring about a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So that means we have attorneys who are, making sure these laws are being enforced, or even, making sure that we get appropriate laws made. And we have campaigners who are engaging the public around, bringing about these changes we want to see in our world. And then I'm a scientist, which means I kind of provide the science background for a lot of the legal work and the campaign work, kind of like what is the science of climate change? So kind of translating the science and putting it into these legal and public contexts. I am a cis gay man.
And is there any other parts of your identity that are worth mentioning or worth noting for you?
My Black identity. Okay. Yeah. And actually my father is Puerto Rican, so I am Black Latino, but that gets a little complicated because I didn't fully grow up with my dad. I do have a relationship with my dad, but I am a lot more in touch with my Black identity. I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, so in Georgia. I am originally from Florida, actually, but when I was about 4 years old, my mom married my stepdad, and we moved to Georgia, and I spent all my time there until I went off to college.
Awesome. And where are you based now?
Based in Los Angeles.
Do you think there's a big difference between where you grew up and where you're based right now?
Very, very much so. I am happy for the difference. It is a change I wanted. I didn't realize the difference. Well, I realize it more now when I go back to Georgia than I did when I was just there. There's less of a weight here for me as a gay man than I felt when I lived there. When we moved to Georgia, we actually moved around a fair amount, different apartments and whatnot. So it was hard to establish a key community where, I had the same friends for years and things like that. They were usually Black communities, but my family kind of kept to itself. I think that's kind of the nature of my parents. But I, of course I had friends in school and all of that, but actually in the neighborhood, and I have neighborhood friends, but I think I might have lacked a bit of community I might have had if we'd stayed in Florida, because that is where my mom's family was. So my grandparents, cousins, aunts. So we kind of left a lot of that. So I didn't have that kind of family, larger community that I would have had if I'd stayed in Florida.
And then did you have any role models growing up?
I'll do the cliche mom thing because my mom went through has had a lot of health issues. When she was 33, she had a stroke, and I was pretty young, and that kind of persisted. And then when I got into my high school ages, my stepdad got hurt at work, so he was out of work, and we had a house foreclosed on, all these things, and my mom was really the rock that kept all of that together. So it's kind of a show of resilience and how kind of if she can make it through all of those things, then there's not a lot of limitations on what people can do. I was always interested in science. From the start, elementary school, I would check out the science books, and it was always the subject. I think that also people thought I would be interested in too, and that might have played a role because I've always been I was quiet but logical thinking and rational according to my family and stuff like that. So I think they also saw me in that science role, so that might have played a role. But I was always drawn to science fiction and everything, so I don't know what like the moment was, but it kind of was always there. I will say in high school, my senior year, I had a physics teacher who he probably doesn't realize it at all, but kind of steered me to where I ended up going, in that I, at that point, said, oh, I'm interested in like physics. And he was like my physics teacher. And he was like, oh, you should apply. Princeton has a good physics program, which was not on my radar at all as a place to like apply to. And so I was like, okay, I'll apply there. And then I got in and I went to Princeton. So like, in a way, he kind of really steered like the direction of things for me. And I don't think he has any idea that that's the case.
And can you talk a little bit more about like your educational path? So you mentioned that you went to Princeton for physics. How did you transition from physics into like biology and climate?
Well, actually, I didn't end up doing physics at Princeton. I went in thinking I would do astronomy and physics. And then I realized I didn't really enjoy the physics as much as I thought I did. So I transitioned over to geo-sciences, which is an interdisciplinary program where you do bring in physics, you bring in biology, you bring in chemistry, and I really like that aspect. And I had already taken a lot of those classes, so I said I'll just do geosciences instead. So I moved over to geosciences, and I got a bachelor's in that, and also a minor in environmental studies. And then that's what brought me to LA for grad school. I came out to USC for a geological sciences department. So I did earth sciences there and spent about 6 years getting my PhD.
I know you mentioned that you were doing a PhD initially for 6 years. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that was about and what you were researching in your PhD?
I was in the geological sciences department or the earth sciences department, I did an oceanography dissertation looking at oxygen declines off the coast and, in ocean waters. So I would go out on these like day-long research cruises and collect samples and come back and like kind of what was the cause of these declines we're seeing over time. And that itself got me interested in more direct climate work, because basically the tie-ins to that are climate change. So when I was looking what to do post-grad school, I did decide I didn't want to do academia. So I was like, well, what else is there for me to do? So I, looked around, I considered, kind of teaching, even environmental consulting. And then another thing was like kind of this kind of advocacy role I'm in now. And I followed through with that, reached out to the Center for Biological Diversity and got this spot in their climate program, and it's been great.
As like a younger person that's trying to get into a field in geosciences and climate change and like science in general, did you feel that there were LGBTQ plus or safe spaces for you in that transition or in that educational path?
I'm not sure if this is universal across sciences, but it felt pretty accepting. Earth sciences, I will say I was never one to lead with I'm gay. So like there were, honestly, to be quite honest, like years where like I just did not discuss my, sexuality like either way at all. Like I didn't pretend anything, but I didn't say anything because it was like, why bring it up? But it did, eventually, of course, like everyone came to know, and the department was very accepting. And I what I was saying before about, I'm not sure if it's true across all sciences, but I feel like scientists tend, for instance, not to be the most religious people, which is a lot of basis of homophobia, and like are more science-oriented, obviously. So I feel like there isn't as much homophobia in a lot of the sciences, just like because logical people thinking logically, this is a biological thing. So I didn't have any issues in that regard. Well, now I work at an environmental nonprofit, and I remember starting there and everyone said, this is my partner or my partner. And I was like, oh, partner, like I have no idea who they're with or whatever. And so I already felt like, oh, this is a very accepting space. And I think environmentalists are generally among the most liberal people. So I've also not, like I'm out to all my coworkers and everything, and they've met, my partner and all of those things. So I say at least in like environmental nonprofit world, it's been good for me. But I can't speak for, of course, for other careers. So I didn't, come out to coworkers, as it were. I would say, my partner, Chad, and I did feel pretty comfortable doing that because of those initial, things that made me feel comfortable. So I mentioned how climate change disproportionately affects certain communities, low-income communities of color, less resource communities. And I can't help but think like queer individuals who are not, supported by their families, who are, unfortunately, like maybe turned out onto the street even. We have such a large homeless population in Los Angeles, and I can't help but think of like how many queer teens there are that are like part of that community, part of that subset of people, and how meanwhile we're having extreme heat waves and weather that is hard to deal with. So like that's like I guess a very literal like line of how being queer may expose you to the impacts of climate in a way that it wouldn't be like for a person who does have like the supportive family that they're able to lean on. So within the environmental work, the climate work, there's such a sense of urgency, rightfully so. Like climate change is here. We need to be tackling it now. But with that urgency comes this, rush to get people to do the work. And I don't think there's always the time taken to make sure those who are recruited are the most diverse people. It's like we need to replace this position now. We just lost someone. And so it does end up being more white, probably heterosexual people, because the extra time isn't always taken to make sure the pool of applicants reflects the diversity you would ultimately want. So I think we need to still, take that time to make sure we have the right pool of people to choose from.
Yeah, for sure. I know we talked about a little bit of your research before. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your current work and what you're working on with the nonprofit?
So the focus is the transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm in California, and a lot of our work is in California, just because California is in many ways like an environmental leader. So kind of if you push California to do something, you can pull other states to follow, and even in some cases like the federal government to follow. So some of our work involves making sure good laws are made at the state level. And we also have federal work also, where like good laws are made at the federal level, and enforcing some of our laws that already exist, or making sure our laws are properly enforced that already exist. For instance, California has the Environmental Quality Act, and there's a national equivalent to that. So we work underneath those to make sure, that projects that are approved are not, environmentally harmful and don't produce excess greenhouse gas emissions. And we also push for, like I said, new laws. So at the state level, we are engaging with legislators to see, laws that are put into place that, promote a proper transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy without promoting what we call false solutions, kind of techno fixes, where like we know we need to phase out fossil fuels. That is the solution. So it's not enough to say, we're working on carbon capture and storage or direct air capture. We're gonna like suck this out of the air. We don't have to change anything we're doing. So we really push back against that kind of thing. And alternative fuels that are harmful to the environment in other ways. For instance, you think biofuels, like, okay, maybe the greenhouse gas emissions over their life cycle may or may not be as bad as fossil fuels. But then down the line, you also have land use change. You're affecting species because you're trying to grow these, for instance, crops to satisfy this fuel need. So like considering all those factors is part of our work. And like I said, they're the attorneys who are doing the litigation. Like if a project was approved that's kind of not in line with the law, like we might have attorneys like kind of go after that kind of project. And if there's a project we don't want to see go through, we might have campaigners who are organizing people. And then once again, the scientists like myself are, well, what is the science that supports our argument for why this project should not go forward?
And I have like two questions separately. For one is, if you had to pick one piece of legislation that you would want to like approve immediately, which one would it be?
We have one that my organization is a part of is this Polluters Pay Fund. It's for state of California. And I actually maybe give you two things. And basically it is to get fossil fuel companies to pay a proportional to like their greenhouse gas emissions they're responsible for, kind of for damages they've caused to the climate. So that's one I of course strongly support. Another one which has actually gone into effect, which speaks to this idea of intersectionality with environmental justice, is there's a Senate bill, SB 1137, which went into effect, which was a health and safety buffer between oil and gas sites and communities of 3,200 feet, saying like we know living near oil and gas wells is associated with significant health harms, pregnancy complications, cancer, respiratory harm, all those kinds of things. So this law went into effect where now oil companies are not allowed to drill new wells within that buffer area. So that's one that was challenged by fossil fuel industry, and then they withdrew their challenge because it was going to be like a referendum on the ballot. Then they withdrew that, and they say they're going to, essentially sue over it, but for right now it is in effect, and we're very happy about that one.
Yeah, it's a good step.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know we talk a lot about like the effects on communities too, just because if you're thinking renewable energy, it's also sometimes it displaces communities or can harm them in other ways, like your health. If you had to pick, which just goes into my second one, question is, if you had to pick a type of renewable energy, which one would be your top idea of like, this is the most sustainable, or this is the one that has the least effects on like our communities, our environment, our species?
So nothing's perfect, I will say. Like everything, you really do have to kind of weigh what are the impacts. But I would say solar, specifically distributed solar, actually, which means, solar panels on rooftops and, unused spaces, because there are more harms that come with utility scale solar. And we actually, do have a program, for instance, that's energy justice related, which is like, kind of taking energy out of the hands of like utilities like that monopolize, the provision of energy, and like kind of putting it more in the hands of communities. So distributed community solar is great, and we can meet a lot of our energy needs with that without having to put more power in the hands of utilities.
Awesome. And then what has been your favorite project you've worked on so far?
One experience I appreciated was, I guess you can consider this a project, the Los Angeles March for Science, which was in 2018. I think the original March for Science was in 2017. It was kind of in response to Trump being president and kind of going after all of these kind of scientifically based things and advisory boards. And up until that point, I feel like there were some, but a lot of scientists, which I respect in a way, it's like we do our research, we put it out into the world, it's for people to use as they will, like that is my role, and I pretty much respect that. But there's also a place for scientists to, communicate that knowledge and say like, this is what needs to be done in response. And I feel like in a lot of ways, the March for Science 2017 and was kind of a turning point for like scientists to be more advocates, saying like, we know the science and this is what needs to be done on climate change and many other things. So I was able to speak at the LA March for Science in 2018, and I feel like in a little way I was like kind of part of that kind of shift where scientists are really making their voices heard.
Can you talk about what you talked about, or like what you were discussing in that march?
Pretty sure I talked about the phase out of fossil fuels. Another project I did, which is kind of related to what I talked about, was writing a report on California's oil and gas and how people, California being this climate leader, people don't think about that California produces oil and gas. And not only that actually, if you think about kind of the emissions over its full life cycle, meaning from production to use, it's among the dirtiest oil you can produce, like on a global scale, like it's pretty dirty stuff. So I did write a report kind of looking at, how that is the case, and how, California being a climate leader should not still be leaning in as heavily as it does into like fossil fuel extraction. Weather is a mood, climate is a personality, as in like climate is a long-term thing. Like, so when we're talking about degrees warming, we're talking about a global average over a long period of time. So yeah, from day to day, you're going to have these natural variations or normal variations in temperature and precipitation. It's those long-term trends that we're talking about. There are certain species, for instance, that have an ideal temperature range, like over a long period of time. So as that changes, they're having to, like, let's say they started at a certain elevation, like on a mountain. Like, so it's like down here is our like ideal place because it's not too hot. But over time, as it's getting warmer and warmer, they're having to move further and further up that mountain. So like their range is shrinking. And that's kind of represents kind of the threat to species, at least, where there's gradually the conditions that are ideal for survival are shifting, and like species are being crowded out of what is ideal for them. And like I said, that's a long-term thing. So we're talking about 1 degree of warming. We're talking about, okay, before in pre-industrial times, it was this temperature, and now, like 1850. And now we're looking at this like big change in temperature, and we are seeing the effects of that. Like hurricanes are stronger than they once, or there are more strong hurricanes, like more Category 5s than there used to be. There's now like studies that link wildfire to our increasing temperatures. The idea of polar vortexes, which is cold weather, which people will cite as, oh, it's cold. It's like just super cold in New York right now. Like, why are you saying that it's warming? It's like, well, because we've affected the temperature balance between our poles, like the Arctic, and like below that, like our Gulf Stream is like, this is one of the theories is that the Gulf Stream is wavering. So like the jet stream in the atmosphere, the jet stream is like dipping further downward and allowing like Arctic weather to come down into the United States. So, which is why we've often moved away. We don't say like global warming as much because it is confusing to people because they're like, it's cold right now. It's like, it's climate change. Like we're moving away from the norms we are like best adapted to into something that we haven't experienced before. Yeah, it's like really a thing about extremes. So you're getting more hot days, more higher temperatures. Like, so like when you have drought, it's a lot worse than it used to be. When you have precipitation, it's a lot more than it used to be. So it's like these extremes on either end that are what are really affecting people. But in the middle, there is still like weather we're used to. But it's like when you hit these extremes, we're just not used to having to deal with it as often as we now are. We know that by and large, fossil fuels are causing the problem. So we do know we need to make that transition. So it's like, well, what is there instead? I think it's part of the question. So, we do lean into solar and wind energy, but we, for instance, don't heavily promote large-scale hydroelectric because it, dams rivers and like affects species. Geothermal is a mixed bag in that it like interferes with water tables. We tend to go, like, that's why we say, distributed solar, like it has less of an impact than, utility scale. Wind, but we have to be considerate of, there are certain bird species that like raptor birds of prey that like really are essentially, they're looking down and they're not looking forward. So like they will literally run into like a wind turbine. So like we have to put in control mechanisms to reduce that, which there are things that are available for that. Electric cars, yes, we very much support, electrifying transportation with battery electric vehicles. But there is the chain of minerals that go into those vehicles. Cobalt is, for instance, very contentious in terms of like it's produced in countries that don't have, proper labor laws and like children are working. We think about lithium, which a lot of it right now comes from South America, where you're drawing down water tables in the process of extracting that lithium. We talk a lot about just transition. Just transition meaning, you're making this transition to renewables in consultation with communities and in consideration of environmental justice principles. So like looking for ways to extract minerals, if you're talking about electric vehicles, sustainably, looking into other methods of like lithium extraction, such as like direct lithium extraction, which is still kind of in pilot phases, but the idea is that you don't have to remove so much water to get it out of the ground. Making sure that where you source other minerals from, they do have, humane work practices. So we don't want to rush the transition in that we just are like, this is what we're going to do now, and then it just kind of creates the same problems or a different version of those problems. So there is an aspect of reducing consumption in general. So like it's not enough to like replace all of Los Angeles's cars with like electric cars. Like we need to be investing in public transportation and walkable cities, so you don't need as many cars to begin with. So in a lot of ways, there's also this aspect of reducing consumption to also reduce impacts. Like if we stop producing all fossil fuels tomorrow, stop burning everything, we would still be experiencing, the conditions we're experiencing, and probably to some degree get worse. But there are things, therefore, that we have to do to adapt. And I think of the example of wildfires in California. We know their severity is increasing. One way to respond to that is to simply not build in places that are very prone to wildfire. And one response, unfortunately, kind of from an industry side, is logging forests preemptively to stop the idea. But that's not what is the answer. The answer is to make sure you're not promoting sprawl development that then opens up people to these kinds of conditions. And also for those who have homes, like make defensible spaces around homes versus, blindly logging forests. So like there are adaptation things that need to be done because we are kind of locked in for some amount of change. And if you think of, Florida with flooding, like climate models say like much of, Florida will kind of be below, like kind of go underwater. Kind of preparing for that, not building new things in places where that sea level rise is going to affect, kind of moving things back and like kind of not waiting until it's too late to start, adapting to what's coming. Environmentalists often seem to be white. They seem to be able-bodied, meaning like, oh, you're going on hikes and you're, very physically able. And I think that might be a hindrance to certain people wanting to be a part, to work in that field, thinking I can't, be one with a disability, or, I don't see people like myself in that so much. And I suppose that does extend, of course, to the queer identity. I can think in my organization, I think I know who the queer people are, or I definitely know some people like personally. And, it isn't, fully representative of the world at large. So I think there is still some work to be done to diversify the field. Career goals kind of stay the course in a way. Like things have changed a lot even since I started work like 8 years ago, where like at that time there was like a struggle to get climate change mentioned on TV, and it was always this false dichotomy of like, let's hear from the climate people and let's hear from the opposite but equal view that like it's not a serious thing. And now mention of climate change is every day. We're experiencing the heat waves every year. Hurricanes are often, even the cold weather is linked to climate change when we have like these polar vortexes. So you see so much of that on TV now, which is great in that it has risen in consciousness, but it's bad in terms of because things have gotten so bad where like we can't ignore it anymore. So the work has become more difficult in a way because like you can't really escape it. I can't like close my computer and like not hear, because then I turn on the TV and there's always something. So like just kind of staying the course and kind of staying optimistic.
What would you say to these people to make it be more optimistic, or like?
Optimism is also from the fact that it is in the human consciousness. So like people now are realizing we need to take action. And, every fraction of a degree matters in terms of warming. So there is something to be gained from doing the work. We should be doing it more quickly. Like progress is being made, it is happening pretty slowly, and we do want it to be faster. But, every bit we do does make it a less harrowing situation. So there are gains to be made no matter what degree you're like trying to do the work. Believe it or not, I wasn't a super outdoorsy person growing up, but then I entered into a geo-sciences program, which that is what geo-sciences is a lot of being in the field. And I took a lot of great trips through school. So I really became more in touch with, nature and wanting to be outdoors. A lot more of those kinds of trips, national parks, hikes, I enjoy. I am a reader, so I do read. I listen to audiobooks, nonfiction audiobooks, read fiction books. That's how I keep those separate. I enjoy cooking. My partner does not enjoy it as much as I do. We alternate, but like I put more joy into the food. So those are just a few things I do when I'm not working. So as a kid, I was very quiet. And I think some of that has carried over where it's a fear of saying the wrong thing or maybe not even sounding knowledgeable or something along those lines. So maybe I would tell him to, like, people will like what you have to say. Like, because I find that today, like, people want to get to know you and people want to engage with you. So like, give them that opportunity.